my first job is to introduce our four panelists. Many of you in the room may already know them. It took me quite a long time to cut their bios down to something short enough. The first of which is Melissa Sterry. Melissa is a design scientist, systems theorist and futurist. She's recognised as a world-leading authority on science, technology and thinking that could help humanity to build a brighter future. A design practice and enterprise and innovation graduate, her career has been spent working with leading-edge ideas, individuals and institutions worldwide. She's a recipient of several national and international innovation, creativity and enterprise awards, including the Mensa Education and Research Foundation International Award for enhancing intelligence that benefits society. Melissa is also listed in the Libertine 100 Women with complex, beautiful, and potentially world-changing ideas. Our next panelist and speaker is Dan Hughes. Dan is founder of Alpha Property Insight. He spent his career working across the built environment and has held senior roles in some of the world's leading data organizations. Dan was Director of Data and Strategy and Information Products for the RICS, where he led the PropTech transformation strategy. And I put this in brackets, as a result, the RICS was recognized as the world's leading PropTech brand and was voted top association at the Global PropTech Awards. Dan has achieved wide personal recognition in this space and was voted one of the top 50 data leaders in the UK in 2017 and voted #1 PropTech influencer in the UK and most influential person online in PropTech. And in 2018, Dan won the inaugural EG Tech Award for bridging the gap between property and technology. Our next speaker and panelist is Amanda Clack. Amanda is Head of Strategic Advisory at CBRE and is Managing Director for Advisory Services in EMEA, supporting clients and their strategic real estate agenda. She's a member of the UK board at CBRE and also a UCEM trustee. Amanda is also, I think, the immediate past president now of the RICS, becoming the longest serving in 123 years, where her themes as president were infrastructure, cities, and the war for talent, skills, diversity, and inclusion. She recently received the accolade of the most influential surveyor of all time. There's a few people in this room that might want to argue with that later. Following the Pride in the Profession nomination from fellow surveyors to celebrate the RICS's 150th anniversary. And fourth, and certainly not least, is Mark Farmer. Mark is the CEO and co-founder of Cast Consultancy. Mark is a chartered surveyor with 30 years' experience in construction and real estate, and he has become recognised as an international commentator on a variety of industry and policy-related issues. Mark is a member of the Mayor of London's Construction Skills Advisory Group, a board member for Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, a co-chair of Constructing Excellence, a trustee of the Moby Education Charity, and an honorary professor at the University of Salford School of the Built Environment. Mark also authored, as I'm sure you're aware, the influential independent government review, in 2016, of a review of the UK's construction labour model entitled Modernise or Die. So with that, now you know the credentials of those that you are going to hear from. I will hand over to our very first speaker, Melissa. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Well, I'm going to take you on a journey to some cities past, look at the present, and then into the possible future. So first we're going to go back. We're going to go back to 1919, the inaugural year of the college. And it was also the year that the Bauhaus opened, arguably one of the most influential schools of building of the 20th century. It was the year of, well, Ferdinand Leger painted the city. Obviously, this was the height of Cubism. And here we have Joseph Steller's Brooklyn Bridge. And this is a futurist picture. And although this was the latter part of that era, this very much expresses the, if you like, narrative of futurism. It's about speed, it's about technology, it's about height, it's about movement. And what these all essentially contributed to was an ideology of the city, not as a typewriter, that is time specific to 2019, but as machine. And collectively, these influenced the predominant ideology of the built environment of the 20th century, modernism, of which the legacy is that which is still about us today, but which is shifting. And this is a very particular kind of perspective of worldview. It's what I call industrial intelligence. Now, the origins of industrial intelligence are very ancient. So, for example, Plato in the Republic exhibited an approach that is very similar in that divide et conquer. It was about dividing, it was about a production process. And indeed, Plato foresaw the ideal city, the perfect city, the future city, as being so production-led that even people's choice of reproductive partner, even the family, was to be efficient and such that people couldn't choose their own partners, but they would be selected for them. And that was very much the metaphor, if you like, for the city as a whole. Everything was to be rational and logical. And speaking to Plato and to Aristotle, the way that we organise our intelligence today, the way that we organise the sciences and indeed all subject matter, indeed everybody here today, falls into categories, archetypes and forms. Prior to this, it was a much more holistic approach to understanding the world about one. But Aristotle, amongst others, believed that you couldn't actually really understand the world unless you broke it down into bits, until ultimately today we're all sat here and many people have a job title in a department, in a company, in a market, in a sector. And some of you, of course, will be very much interactive with those other sectors. But in some instances, when we look at our world today and how we understand everything from our day-to-day lives to the future city, we find that, see the little boxes along the bottom, we find that people have become very disconnected. That they don't perhaps understand what is happening in other disciplines, and for that reason they don't understand other perspectives on one and the same problems that they are collectively trying to solve. Now, you'll all know of Le Corbusier. His ideal future city is pictured here. It's the Radiant City. And what's very interesting about this is it looks monumental. It looks almost Egyptian in the height and the sort of greatness of these buildings, all highly ordered. And what's really, it speaks to the world as it was forming, because prior to this, we had architectures, we had approaches that were very much inspired by the natural world, by religion. When you think back to the great architectures of the past, they had a very entwined relationship with the various faiths of the world. That was where you looked. You looked to the temples to find the very finest examples of the built world. But that was changing in the early 20th century. And essentially, this is an architecture that is about one entity, and that entity is man. Because these are not worshipping some ethereal force, some other thing. And they're certainly not aware of the natural world. Although Le Corbusier spoke to the natural world, his architectures are the antithesis of that, because there is nothing in and of those architectures that accommodates for the natural world. It's not the bat in the belfry situation where the natural world might accidentally infiltrate these, or indeed a conscious choice to accommodate for the natural world. These are about us and us only. So is that perfection? Is that narrative that we were working to throughout the 20th century and that formed the very earliest foundations of the 21st century built environment, is it perfection? Well, as Lewis Mumford said, we sleep under the light of stars that have long since ceased to exist, and we pattern our behaviour to ideas which have no reality as soon as we cease to credit them. Now we are questioning the architectural narrative that we have worked to, and we are doing so because a couple of realisations are coming about. Now let's look very quickly to Hong Kong to get an idea of where we're at the moment. This is essentially a modernist city. It is a futurist city, it's a cubist city. It's boxy, a la cubist. It is futurist. The futurists loved skyscrapers. They saw them as the ideal within and of the built environment, highly efficient. And it is the rational city. This is, if you like, the city of the Bauhaus dreams. But it's not Le Corbusier's city. Why is that? So we've ticked these boxes here. Because it's not geometric. If we just pop back, if you think to the Radiant City, it was all organised. But this is reality. This is the real world. And what this shows is that the reality of modernism is that though modernism sought to control everything socially, culturally, politically, and indeed even the earth systems, because with all of those early architectural narratives of the early 20th century, there was no understanding of how those architectures would cope in a changing environment. Many of them are appalling in terms of their capacity to deal with the heat island effect, to deal with heavy precipitation, to deal with flooding and all the issues of the moment. But at that time, the great thinkers of that age thought that we could overpower these other systems. And I've chosen a work of art here. You will know it's Damien Hirst's Shark, but it's the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, to encapsulate the ideal of the 20th century and of the early 21st century. This is a shark. It is a natural creature that is being so controlled by us, by man, that it's not even allowed to die, and that this is kept in a pristine state via a chemical concoction, including formaldehyde. This is nature as the 20th century saw it, and that affects how we understand the world about us, and it is infused into a very, very many of the future city proposals of the present. But to explain that, I'm going to take you into science fiction. So I'm going to read out in a moment a couple of short flash fictions that have a think about some of the things we might not have considered in some of the proposals of the present. I think you will all know urban forests. You will all have seen trees on skyscrapers. You will all read the rhetoric. So let's now turn to science fiction. The city of London, England. Trees turned into torches as embers cast adrift by an east wind ignited the tinder-dry urban forest with the ferocity of fire of 400 years earlier. The city's fire hydrants fallen victim to the several year-long droughts. Citizens fled frantically by whatsoever means were at their disposal. That story is set in September 2nd, 2066. It is not an if London is going to have water shortages. London is on a trajectory, according to the best climate science we have, to have water shortages. And yet, we know also that we as humans, when we create things, we don't necessarily maintain them, we don't necessarily interact with them as was originally intended. What are some examples of that? Well, the arson attacks in the advent of Grenfell Tower is one. Another is the fact that, some people can't even keep a spider plant, no disrespect, let alone necessarily maintain foliage on their balcony or their exteriors. How dangerous could this be? Well, if you look back over the fire records of London this past few years, you'll find instances in which not one story, not two stories, but 3 stories burnt because a pot plant on a balcony was left unattended and caught fire, always by an unintended source. In the instance of one, a cigarette that was casually flicked, ignited the plant, up goes the building. And yet, when we look to urban forest proposals, how many of you have seen one that is alight or is in a drought situation when London is on a hosepipe ban? How many of you looked at that? That's a possible image of future London. Floating cities. Many of you will have seen the glass dome cities that supposedly are the solution to the polar ice caps melting. We will supposedly live in these cities atop the ocean waves. Now, there are many, many, many levels on which we could critique this. But again, I'm going to take you into the realm of science fiction to help illuminate just one of the issues. Ningaloo floating city, Western Australia. The sound of tsunami warning sirens aside, the gated community atop the remnants of a reef had fallen silent. Before dawn, its ocean-top glass domes would be shattered by projectiles in the form of anthropogenic debris of assorted description that was travelling at speeds of up to 500 miles an hour across the Indian Ocean. That story is set in 2079. The scenario is that we have started to move into floating cities, but unfortunately, nature has intervened with a V7 eruption event in Bali. And within and of the story from which this is taken, I looked at all of the possible scenarios within and of that environmentally and exactly what the wave heights would be, tsunami wave heights would be, whereupon a side of the volcano that was erupting fell down. And if we look at this illustration, it's actually very dark there. But essentially the domes are a few hundred feet high. There's Ningaloo Island, which is this is a real topography. And the wave heights would come to nigh the top of those domes. Why have I put projectiles in there? Well, look at the oceans of the present. Then think about tsunamis. Think about the accounts of Tambora. Think about Krakatoa. Whole ships were taken with these tsunami waves, which were much, much bigger than anything that we have witnessed in well over 200 years. So they will carry this debris across the ocean at phenomenal speeds, and yet there are some that are proposing these glass domes atop the ocean without even the most basic understanding of oceanography, without even having those conversations, or even thinking about, well, hang on a moment, why is it that an oil rig is on a platform that is elevated? The earth science community could literally destroy these proposals. Why is this happening? Well, why is it happening? This is getting back to ideologies, this is getting back to worldviews. Going to H.G. Wells, who I would credit as the very greatest futurist of all time. Obviously, you will know him as a science fiction writer, but he mixed with the leading scientific thinkers of his age. He thought about becoming a scientist, and he infused in his works explorations of how and why very many discoveries of that age might affect the future. He anticipated everything from genetic engineering to divisions in society and all manner of things. So I'd very much advise you, if you don't know his body of works, look to it, read it, because there were many things he wrote all that time ago in 1905 that were highly relevant to the present. But he wrote, the utopia of a modern dreamer must needs differ in one fundamental aspect from the nowheres and the utopias men planned before Darwin quickened the thought of the world. Those who were all perfect and static stages of balance of happiness, one forever against the forces of unrest and disorder that inhere things. What did he understand? Well, he understood the relationship with things. He understood how one thing connects to another. He understood how the natural world is ultimately the governor of all that we build, and how we can't erect control systems that overcome many of these events and many of these activities as are coming at us. Unrest and disorder. Now, there are many schools of scientific thought that relate to this, but that in itself expresses where we are now heading. We are arriving at a time where we're having to consider, well, how will a building adapt to its environment? What are our options? What are options materially, engineeringly? Do we even need to build that building? And where do we look? Where should we look in order to find those answers? Well, in order to understand our options, we need to understand that our worldview and our architectural and our built environment paradigm has formed, it is condensed from a very narrow pool. There are a whole world of different architectural styles, of peoples, of philosophies, many of them that have lived with environmental change and incredibly well for millennia. Since the Bronze Age, we, humanity, have been building for flooding. We have been building for fires. We've been building for all of these things. And we have evolved intelligent solutions that have effectively become forgotten. So our future is not a destination. None of us in this room know what is coming. We only know bandwidths. We can edit out the worst case scenarios, or we can accept them and then think creatively and then speak with our peers to see the full range of opportunities around us. I hear many, many people quote what are speculations on the future, thinking that they are fact. The city of the future will have X population in X year, and X population will live in cities. It is entirely speculation. If we start dropping in and out changes, then those whole trajectories shift. So when you're thinking about the future city, don't hang on these statistics, because they can be very wrong. The future is not linear. The future is a matrix of different entities that can shapeshift and adapt at any time. And if we think of that in the way that we address future cities, we might not know what the future city will look like. We might not be able to sketch it to create a flashy CGI, but we can understand how it might work and why it might work and why we, as a species, and indeed other species, might interact with it. So mind your cognitive bias, mind your disciplinary bias, mind your cultural bias, your gender bias, and every other bias you can think of, because the way that you think about cities will be very particular and possibly very remote from the way that others do. So make those connections with others. And for the future of education, in my opinion, we need to expand this process. It's already happening. We are already in a society where transdisciplinary research and where relations between different colleges, different institutions, and so forth is expanding. But we need to build on that so that in 100 years' time, when the future students of this college are tackling what could be profoundly immense challenges. They do so with all of the aptitude and all of the excellence of the students of 1919. And if we don't think that they can achieve that, well, then think to what those students would have achieved in World War II. And also, just lastly, I'll round it up, Future London. I'd love to hear your thoughts. We all are going to be sharing ideas on futures of cities. Share yours, there's the hashtag, reiterating it. What will future London look like? In this scenario, it's flooded. I know Amanda's going to be speaking to a bit of flooding, but it could be something else. Share it, because by sharing, we will get a better idea. Thank you.
Follow that. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Technology in the real estate sector is not something that's new. But what is changing is that we're at a stage where it's starting to shift, not so much from being a tool that we use to do our jobs, but fundamentally shifting the sector itself. And this afternoon, what I'd like to do is look at two things. Firstly, have a look at how the property sector is starting to change because of technology. How is the fundamental shape of it starting to shift? And then secondly, have a very brief look at how the UK is positioned as a market for the coming years about to embrace and lead this digital transformation. So I think when we talk about the digital transformation of real estate, we can look at it in about 6 different themes or categories. And I just want to spend a minute or so on each one of these explaining what they are. And the first one is about the product to service. So this is all about customer experience. So in the past, we've built boxes for people to go and live or work in. And in the future, it's all going to be about how that building adds to their productivity or their well-being or their happiness. It's about services on demand, so you pay for what you want. And it's about speed and flexibility. So we're very much going from a product to a service sector. The second thing is it's going to have an impact on the jobs that we do. And if you read the press and if you have a look around, there's an awful lot of coverage about what's going to happen to roles in general. An awful lot of this is negative. So McKinsey, a couple of years ago, did a report which suggested that up to 44% of today's real estate roles may well be automated in the future. And this is presented as a very negative thing, but actually, instead of looking at jobs itself, we can start looking at the tasks within them and get a better understanding of where the opportunities and the challenges are. So if you'll excuse the very crude model for a surveyor, most people's roles will fit into 4 very broad tasks that make up their job. So collecting data, creating some form of analysis of it, putting it into a format for communication, whether that's a report or something else, and then finally the overall advice, the human aspect to it that goes over the top of the whole process. And we can use this as a framework to look at the tools and start putting some of those buzzwords that are flying around about technology so we can understand how it's going to change the roles in the future. So, for example, when it comes to collecting data, in the past we might have used a camera or tape measure. Going forward, we're talking about the Internet of Things, or mobile phones, or drones. All of these things collect huge amounts of data. Now, for real estate, that's a really good thing because we haven't been very good at collecting data in the past. But the problem is that we have, and we're going to get even more data coming. We don't know what to do with this, and we can't make sense of it. So this is where we get to the next stage, and we talk about things like artificial intelligence, or big data, and machine learning. And this is where we start using technology to help us make sense of the vast amounts of data that's coming out. In terms of the communication, this is where we talk about things like augmented reality and virtual reality. So it's about enhancing experience. And then finally, there's the human aspect that fits over it at the end. And if we look at how this is going to change in the future, the 2 left-hand side columns, collecting data and analyzing it, is where technology is incredibly good. So these are the parts of roles which are going to become automated. But more often than not, these are the parts that are very process-driven and we don't enjoy so much. The communication aspect is not so much about automation and replacement, it's much more about enhancement. So for example, in the past you might have used a photograph to buy a property to look at it. In the future you might look at a virtual reality model. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just a much more immersive, engaging experience. And overlaying all of this is the human aspect, the advice, the interaction, and I believe that ethics is going to be one of the really driving factors behind all of the future responsibilities. And I would argue that actually the need for that human advice is not going to disappear, it's actually going to become even more necessary as the world becomes more complicated. Of course, splitting down everyone's role into 4 tasks is overly simplistic. And just over a year ago, RICS did a piece of research which looked at the same thing for about 45 different tasks. And I know you can't see all of them there, but it's worth noting that the blue and red are the tasks that are going to be automated in the future. And so there is an awful lot of blue and red there, but there's also an awful lot of grey. So the role of the person is going to become increasingly important. Technology is starting to change business models. Now, there are lots of different examples of how this is changing, and there are a couple up there now. I'm just going to pick on 2 of those due to the time. So the first one is we're seeing different people investing in real estate and in real estate companies. Real estate is a very attractive, slow to move, steady, counter-cyclical investment class. Technology is exactly the opposite. And as we find investors who are starting to come into this space with different motivations, it means companies who are working in the same space have got very different parameters to work in. Just to give you an example, I spoke to a technology investor the other day who said specifically they would never invest in a company that's making a profit. Because if they're making a profit, they're not growing fast enough. And that type of environment is a very different challenge for us to work in. The other one is also the bottom one there, so the environment that we work and use as companies now. So all of our processes have been built about the very characteristics of the sector. So it's slow to change. Our processes, the skills, the people are all about slow, steady, low-risk change. But from a technology point of view, it's changing on an unprecedented scale, so we need to move much, much quicker. So the challenges for the businesses going forward are how can we find ways of not looking at 5 or 10-year decisions or investment decisions, but look at much quicker decisions, but at the same time as that, learn to steal a phrase from the technology sector, fail fast. And this is all about doing something, doing it quickly, but if it doesn't work, stopping it quickly as well. And I'd argue that in the real estate sector, we tend to take a long time to make a decision, but then also quite a long time to stop it once it's up and running. The sectors that we work in are blurring. So the real estate sector, from life to death, is a very siloed organisation. It's a cliche that you use a lot. So from land and planning through to construction, through to the operation and the various different aspects of that, they all tend to work in different silos. But as technology is creating huge amounts of data, the data itself is flowing through, which gives us a much better visibility of the life cycle of a building. So the sectors and the life cycle is becoming more important and blurring. But it's not just the time side of things. If you look at the traditional asset classes that we're set up in, and most of our services, businesses look at, they're also starting to blur. So there are a couple of examples here on the screen. So on the top left, you've got the well-documented co-working and WeWork, companies like that, where they are starting to employ more and more people from the hospitality sector. And this is all about that customer-focused approach to things. It's becoming product to service, so it's all about hospitality. At the top right, you've got a car park. Actually, this has got a fascinating story about technology and increasing capacity. But the reason it's up here is this also recognises that cars may not need to park within some point in the future. 5 years, 50 years, whenever it is. But at the point of this being built, they built in the design for it to be converted to residential and commercial. So buildings are already being designed for multiple uses throughout their life cycle because of the impact of technology. The bottom left-hand side, you've got what's known as a dark store. Just by a show of hands, has everyone heard of a dark store? Okay, about half. So this is, in all intents and purposes, this is a supermarket. It's not a great photo, but it looks like a supermarket. The truth is this is actually more of a warehouse. So this is purely for online shopping. So no customers go into this at all. So we've got very much an industrial environment with a supermarket customer retail type of approach. And then finally, at the bottom right-hand side, you've got the residential sector. So with the growth of things like PRS, huge amounts of commercial property type organisations are now starting to look at the residential side of things. So all the sectors that we work in are starting to blur. Underpinning all of this is standards, and everything gets more complicated, and the data that's being created is going to have to be standardised as it goes throughout the life cycle. Now, that doesn't mean everything has to be standardized and there need to be standards for everything, but there has got to be some consistency that goes through. And when you've got those standards, and as things get more complicated, it's going to be increasingly important to have regulation. So things are going to have to become more and more regulated. And the real estate sector is going to absolutely have to get on board with that, but also get to terms with data standards and data regulation, which is very different from the traditional surveying approach. And then finally, new companies are entering the space. So technology is a gateway that a lot of companies are using to get into here, and here are just a few examples. So the very big technology companies are now focusing on the built environment. So Facebook are building houses in America. Google in Canada is developing and planning an entire city or part of Toronto. You've got new tech companies. So not so long ago, you would have never trusted a 2, 3, 4-man company with your data or technology. Yet now they're capable of offering exactly the same level of service as companies like Google. And so huge numbers of startups have very quickly become viable businesses that can operate and focus on very small problems. Here they've been supported by VCs, and the two diagrams there, two logos are companies who are venture capital organizations. So Concrete is one that's based in the UK and Metaprop in the United States. And they're specifically focusing on the real estate sector to make sure that these companies have a real focus in the funding. Bottom left, you've got new real estate companies, WeWork being the most obvious example, which is not really a technology company, but is fundamentally based on and built on new technology. And then companies who are already in the advisory space, such as KPMG and PwC, who are both very active in this space, looking to excuse me, use technology to get into the new spaces. So the real estate sector is going to fundamentally change because of technology, and there are 6 overall themes there to how it's going to change. And if that's the case, then we were commissioned by the British Property Federation to write a report for them, which was published earlier this year. And that looked at what is the state of digital transformation within the UK, and more important, how is it going to go forward and how is the UK positioned? And part of the report was looking at the general environment. So what are the ingredients and the market conditions that are needed for digital transformation for the next 10, 20 years? And we identified 7 different themes that you can see down there around data infrastructure, investment, and technology infrastructure, as well as the maturity of the real estate market itself. And we looked at these for 10 different countries, plus the UK, and we carried out a load of data analysis to come up with scores. So we've scored each one of those criteria for each one of the countries. We've set each criteria, the top score is 100 as the benchmark, and then everything comes down from that. And if we assume that everyone who scored 90% or above can consider that ingredient as a strength, we can start seeing how the different countries match up, where their strengths and weaknesses are. And you can see that the UK is incredibly well positioned, especially in some of the areas where other countries aren't, such as the data infrastructure, transparency, and so on. So real estate is going to fundamentally change because of technology. The shape of the business is going to go forwards in a very different way from the past. It's going to happen much slower than some people think, and much faster than others. And the UK is incredibly well positioned to capitalize on that and become the world leader in this space. So thank you very much for your time. I very much look forward to your questions in the panel session afterwards. Thank you.
It's a truism that change is the only constant in life. We live in a world that's in constant flux and where the pace of change is accelerating. As built environment professionals, we need to adapt to that change as the world around us changes, and our role as creators and influencers helps shape the world of tomorrow. Today, I want to share with you my thinking for the future built environment in terms of the global context forcing our changing world on us as individuals, as organisations, and for our clients. Urbanity, looking at the increasing importance of the role of cities, defining the key elements to people within them. The changes impacting the corporate real estate portfolio as we look to 2040, and finally considering briefly how London itself may evolve in 100 years' time. So, well, what do I know? Well, For the last 4 years, I've been looking at futures as some form of built environment clairvoyant. Thinking about transformational change, our cities today are facing major challenges driven by rapid population growth, climate change, automation, and also globalization. The way we plan and evolve our cities today will be defining the factor to their future success. It's interesting when we look at that change in the context of events that have happened since 2015, when I helped develop a report for RICS, Our Changing World, Let's Be Ready. There's been the Greek government's debt crisis that heightened in 2015 when it became the first country to fail an IMF loan. The UK's decision to leave the European Union in June 2016. November that year saw Modi wipe out 86% of its cash overnight to tackle corruption. And then there was the impeachment of Brazil's president in 2017. And of course, we now have what is colloquially called the Trump effect. The unpredictability of what's happening around us to our businesses and our clients. Continuous disruption is now the new normal. The other norm in our lives is, as Dan said, is all about technology. The number one concern of professionals from the report was, how do I remain relevant in a changing world? Radical transformation is happening to property, people, and place, with a new interaction at a city scale, supported by data and powered by technologies. We already have with us many technological capabilities through BIM, digital twin, smart sensors, IoT, AI, 3D printing, MMC, offsite manufacturer, prop tech, and so much more. Looking ahead, there are technologies and concepts that we know about today that might not yet have been fully tested or made it of being viable. Things like Hyperloop, for example, which may transport you from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 20 minutes, but currently might kill you in the process. We, as built environment professionals, have a responsibility to prepare for these changes and adapt accordingly because the pace is increasing. Another major trend I'm sure you're very aware of is urbanization. In 1950, 30% of the world's population lived in urban areas. Today, it's 54%. And by 2050, the United Nations predicts that we'll be an almost exclusively urban species, with 80 to 90% of people living in cities. In 1970, there were 2 megacities, Tokyo and New York. Today, 23, and by 2025, there'll be 37. 13 of those new megacities will, of course, be in China. And China is building a conglomerate of cities of 100 million people. Jingjingjai will become a name we'll all know. 50% of urban population growth in our cities is in just 7 countries: India, China, Nigeria, Indonesia and the United States, Pakistan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I bet you didn't get the last one. By 2100, according to Global Cities Institute, the biggest cities will be Delhi at number 5 with 57.3 million people, Mumbai, Dar es Salaam, Kinshasa, and the number 1, Lagos, Nigeria at 88.3 million people. I know statistics aren't everything, but my goodness, they set a scene. Fastest growth, however, will be in the smaller cities of 1 to 5 million people, with India building a city the size of Chicago, 2.5 million people every year for the next 26 years. And remember, half of India's population is currently under 25, and Latin America's average age is as high as 29. The median age of Nigeria sits at just 18, and across all of Africa's 54 countries, it sits at 20. By 2030, the OECD predicts that the global middle class will more than double in size to 4.9 billion people, demanding more homes, cars, travel, and consumer goods. To keep up, construction output will have to increase by 70% in the period between 2015 and 2025 alone, with 7 nations accounting for that growth: the US, Canada, China, India being amongst the leaders. And if the Belt and Road actually comes to fruition, global GDP will increase by 9%. But of course, against that backdrop, we're short of resources. By 2030, the world would need at least 50% more food, 45% more power, and 30% more water than it did in 2012. There's a shortfall in infrastructure, McKinsey predicting 57 trillion needed by 2030. And the age demographics of our cities is changing as generations overlap and as people, thankfully, are living longer, but unfortunately working longer. Households are getting smaller and technology is changing how we live and how we work. And again, the story of people and technology is intertwined. Geographic mobility is increasing. 3 billion have access to the internet today, and mobile phone usage is increasing from 2.2 billion in 2012 to 4.6 billion this year, of which 1.5 billion of those will of course be in China and 1.1 billion in India, providing accessibility to information, data like never before. Data is and will become increasingly significant as the digital oil. Half of the world's data was created last year alone, and 0.8% of it was analysed. Technology is not just simply a nice to have, it's an essential part of modern day living and working. So with all that change and the challenges ahead, what will cities need to be in terms of being resilient and also successful? Cities are literally taking on nations. Shanghai has a population of 26 million people and is indeed larger than that of Australia. The mega cities of the future will be literally taking on nations, with economic power too shifting as global middle class grows, with people being attracted to cities at a rate, according to the United Nations, of 3 million people every week. But we know that success is no longer purely about size. Aspects such as innovation, livability, and an ability to transform and adapt to a changing and socio-economic landscape are becoming increasingly important. We need cities that are resilient and that can face the challenges that the future will throw at them. Urbanity, the art and the science coming together of bringing cities and people successfully living together through placemaking are essential. We looked at our cities at CBRE and completed a research report on the future of UK cities called, quite simply, Our Cities, which identified 3 overarching themes which I wanted to share today, all of which are prerequisites for success: governance, innovation, and culture. Governance is the most obvious factor. It's about how do you create a thriving city? Well, to do so, you require strong leadership based on clear vision and aspirations that are underpinned by the ability to make, coordinate and fund decisions about how that city is going to evolve. Innovation is again perhaps an obvious driver of growth and success in today's cities, but that goes beyond the impact of technology. It also includes the ability of a city to attract and adapt to the brightest talents and the brightest minds. Those cities that have the critical mass required to support the highest quality education will be the ones that invariably survive and attract the top talent. But culture too is increasingly important and is perhaps that buzzing element of a city that really makes it successful and so appealing to people, but is so often overlooked. Aspects such as art, music, food, architecture and museums all contribute to the way in which people feel about their city. And if our cities can successfully balance the unique interplay of governance, innovation and culture, they'll become the economic drivers for growth. CBRE also looked at Portfolio 2040, and our recent European Occupier Survey uncovered 4 distinct themes around what is the future of real estate, and I'd like to share with you that in the context of what the built environment holds. Well, first of all, in the next 20 years, portfolio planning cycles are going to become shorter, with a stronger focus on flexibility in terms of space and also leases, and rapid adaptation of changing business drivers, particularly around talent and agility, that puts the emphasis on combining the user experience with that of technology. And in fact, businesses will need buildings that allow them to move in and out, grow and contract as the business breathes with the way in which the environments around it are changing quickly. Where not normal becomes the new normal. Change will be a permanent fixture for business, but indeed it will be disruption without the friction. AI and technologies will enable better alignment between supply and demand, based on consumer data, allowing businesses to flex much more readily than they do today. The survey identified that 56% of occupiers across Europe see serviced or furnished offices as their preferred format to deliver their space requirements. Most companies, even large ones, will act like today's startups, agile and flexible, responding directly to consumer demands. Yet we identified that 63% of businesses have no formal user experience or user strategy. And by 2040, the age of ownership will be over. Occupiers obviously need to build their own building or asset. Well, instead they won't. They'll move towards sharing, leasing, and using on demand. Companies will adopt to an asset-light approach. They won't want to be tied down by large portfolios or particular location because their businesses will be changing so rapidly. And the headquarters building as we know it will still have a place, but it will be much smaller, more luxurious and more attractive, a trophy workplace whereby people see it as a reward for users, connected to a wider network of smaller, flexible offices. Buildings themselves will become much more fluid to mirror the ever-changing businesses within them. Even today, we're seeing mobile walls used by companies that dismantle and create entire new workspaces at the touch of a button. In the future, smart buildings will of course do it for themselves, using technology, AI and robotics to enable all of that to happen. So what does that mean for the built environment? Well, with a shift in occupier attitudes, there's a massive opportunity for investors. Talent will be transformed by enabled and virtual and digital technologies. More than 50% of employees will be contingent workers by 2040, with job descriptions that no longer specify a location, with a focus on talent enabled by technology. Data scientists and more generalists, consultant-type roles will outweigh the specialists. But will we be overtaken by robots? Well, no, because on one hand, data is king. It enables better business decisions. But as Dan pointed out, the fundamental motivation will be knowledge and better decision-making, which is all about the human factor. And of course, if we look at the role of holograms and avatars, these will no longer be the things of the imagination. They'll be everyday aspects of corporate life and go some way to solving the skills crisis. So, well, what about London? Well, if it navigates the global challenges and builds on its current success, what will our city look like in 100 years' time? I say that sitting quite close to the Thames Barrier and feeling quite safe at the moment, because assuming it's not substantially underwater, of course, it's important that in the next 100 years, we address the impacts of global warming and extend the Thames Barrier accordingly. It's imperative that we must address the potential impacts of climate change and extreme weather events for this city or any city to survive. So on a positive, well, what might London 2120 look like? Well, it will contain many aspects that, of course, we still recognise. A unique blend of heritage buildings amongst a myriad of new high-rise to attract the top talent of the future. But this urbanity of the future built environment will indeed change. It will be car and white van free, with road space being given over to the public realm, culture and art. The city will appear greener, with buildings showing the sustainability outside in. Drones will be flying freely, landing everywhere on our rooftops and our balconies. People will be being transported in rapid pods, with the underground possibly being used for low-grade service, waste and low-grade transportation. Our car parks may become farms. Robots will be moving amongst us as humans as part of everyday objects. Buildings will be flexible and adaptive. Buildings will connect one another at multiple levels with lifts going vertically and horizontally. Interactions between buildings and people will indeed be seamless. But most importantly for London, we'll be able to control the weather through greater district envelopes and the use of cloud and solar management systems. So, the future of the built environment is about more, better, faster. The future for us as built environment professionals is about adaptation and creativity in a technologically enabled world. Together, we're creating tomorrow's future today. Thank you.
Wow. Right, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk to you this evening with my Moby hat on. As Ashley said in my bio, I'm a trustee of Moby, which is George Clark's educational charity. We've had 3 very stimulating and thought-provoking presentations talking about the future, and that's what the exam question was. But I'm going to sort of bridge the gap between the current and the present of where we are in the industry and everything we've just heard, hopefully, and really sort of demonstrate the need as to why we need this paradigm shift to a new way of thinking and what impact that potentially has around talent, attracting talent, and also educating talent, which is obviously highly relevant for UCEM. What I would say is this all starts for me with an understanding of the industry's major challenge, which is that I believe we are in a period of time which is unprecedented, and we're facing this looming reduction in what I call structural resiliency. And what do I mean by that? If you look at that graph there, that is the percentage of total employment that the construction sector takes up. And what you see is cyclicality in line with economic cycles that we've had over the last 30 years. But what's really telling is that every time we have a recovery out of a recession, the recovery line gets shallower and shallower. And this resiliency, which is the ability for the industry to flex, so as we go through economic cycles, we shed labour, we then try and reinflate labour to address the capacity demands that are put on the industry, is becoming more and more difficult. And there's a series of things that sit behind that. Demography has already been picked up, is a key thing. We have an ageing workforce. And actually, it's quite subtle. So you look at these lines, you can see the trends are that the younger component of our workforce is going down and the older component is going up. It's not particularly amplified, but it's a trend. And that is a reflection of the fact we have this ageing workforce, and combined with the fact that our ability to grow young talent is really under pressure. Our diversity of talent is shockingly poor, and it's been spoken about a lot. We're about 12% female representation in the industry. I think that goes down to about 1% on construction sites. So the diversity and inclusion level in our industry is shockingly poor. And if we've only got that level of, certainly from a gender balance perspective, but it's also relevant for ethnicity, we're only fishing in a proportion of the talent pool. So we have to address that if we're going to offset this big looming issue around the fact that we have a demographic attrition problem. And we also have societal change. So combined with the fact that we're not actually attractive as an industry to a large proportion of the prospective workforce, we have a perception issue which pervades certainly construction, but I would say the wider built environment sector as well, which is reflected in these statistics, whether it be public perceptions of construction as being strenuous, dirty, or not exciting. But also it's manifesting itself in the fact that construction, which is 7-8% of the workforce in the UK, is slipping down the relative league tables as to how many people it's employing. In the period from 2011 to 2017, it fell from 7th to 12th place in the relative rankings. And a recent survey, I think it was only done last week, by Stace, I believe it was, showed that this is 800 16 to 18-year-olds. Only 26% had heard of the RSES. So our promotional reach into the wider public, and certainly to kids, is not strong. And that must be a cause for concern in terms of our ability to bridge this attrition gap. And ultimately, what this means is that we have this productivity challenge. Everything I talk about in the industry, and certainly in construction, is about productivity and how we're going to address productivity. And, you know, construction has bumbled along the bottom. We've seen this graph many, many times before. Manufacturing and other sectors have taken off in the last 30, 40 years. And what's clear is that every attempt to just draw labour into our industry in a very traditional model and just get headcount up is not going to work for all the reasons I've just said. But actually, it's not the solution to our productivity issues. So to use a quite well-known graphic from the late 70s in a slightly different context, it's not just about labour. It's about talent and skills base, which is not about headcount. It's not about press ganging into our industry. We want talent. We want people, whether it's people on construction sites doing trade work, all the way through to professional and technical skills. We want a higher level of talent. And this resourcing crisis is not just about bricklayers. Everyone thinks this is, we haven't got enough brickies. This is about professional services. It's about planners, architects, surveyors, you name it. We have an issue across every part of the built environment sector. And actually, this is increasingly manifesting itself in a way that is quite worrying. So the most obvious one being certainly financial risk. A whole litany of headlines here we've seen over the last two or 3 years, probably 2 years actually. The ability for certainly large contractors to hold risk has deteriorated, and that's led to financial fragility, culminating in Carillion. Or did it culminate? No, because since Carillion, it's gone on, and we've had headline after headline, which shows that we have a really, really fundamental structural issue in terms of the ability to take risk, and it's all linked back to skills. This is not something which is decoupled from the slides I've just put up. This is down to the fact, the ability, skills in the boardroom, actually, as well as skills on the construction site, and the ability to know that you're going to get a predictable outcome. And this is also playing out in certain sectors in particular, but you know, you look at the schools debacle in Scotland, you look at major project delivery, such as Spurs, you look at obviously all of the bad press that's happening at the moment about Crossrail. This does not bode well in terms of the ability for the industry to move forward in a way which is predictable. Actually, businesses are sustainable in how they can deliver to their clients. And the home building sector, which is where I primarily work in the residential sector, is right in the eye of the storm. So you only have to look at, again, the consumerism that's taking over our society now, the sort of TripAdvisor culture, which is coming to construction all of a sudden, is going to increasingly be part of what businesses have to deal with. And you know, this is really typified by what happened quite recently. We all know what happened after that interview with the CEO of Persimmon. This is not going to go away. This is something where actually the media, the public at large, has got their teeth into the fact that the construction industry, the development sector to an extent is all implicated in this, is not delivering. It's actually rewarding itself in a disproportionate way, but it's not delivering the outcomes that actually society are expecting it to deliver. And it's really important. You know, if you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, you look at, you know, Google's 20-odd years old, and the amount of change that's happened since Google landed in our world, in our everyday lives. You know, we work differently, we eat differently, we communicate, we buy products differently, but when it comes to the built environment and construction, we're pretty much doing the same thing across planning, design, procurement, construction, and the valuation of assets as well. That doesn't feel right to me. And I think, you know, a good enough challenge is to ask the question, if any one of these people were involved in housing design, just to take an example, would it actually create a different outcome? Whether it be Greg Christie at Apple, whether it be James Dyson, whether it be Terence Conran, design-led thinking is the point I'm making here about how it would be different. It will be technology, science, engineering-led thinking that's coming into real estate, which we do not see enough of, but it would also combine this sort of issue about how do we get beauty and function, and it certainly wouldn't look like that. I think, you know, what this slide I use quite a lot, it's quite heavy, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's really a relationship slide about the problems we have in our industry and where they all stem from. They stem from design uniqueness. We bespoke design everything we do. We're too site labour intensive and we're too fragmented. And for me, to move that into a success model, we have to do 4 things. One is to move towards manufacturing-led thinking and systemisation of how we approach the construction and real estate process. We have to integrate our processes through more collaborative procurement models, and we have to enable that through 2 things. One is digital technology and augmentation, but specifically we have to transform our skills base. And that's the bit I'm going to focus on, because it's actually the skills-based piece which is the toughest nut to crack in all of this, in my view. So the whole idea of moving to digital manufacturing type thinking, for me, actually is not the biggest issue. It's more about procurement and skills, talent, and human capital. Digital manufacturing is coming. You can already see external disruption coming into this market. We've heard quite a lot about it already. It's going to come. But actually, our industry's ability to actually deliver on that is about how we're going to bring a new form of education that innovates so we can make the most of digital manufacturing, so we haven't got a skills mismatch. We actually, at the moment, we've got a skills gap, but we might have a skills mismatch as well. And I think this design thinking thing is really important. So design-centric companies, and this graph shows design-centric companies and their shareholder worth going up disproportionately compared to the balance of the economy. It's worth thinking about how that might apply in the real estate sector and in the construction sector. If you think differently and creatively and actually take some of the thinking of an Apple or Dyson or whatever, we can generate better outcomes, actually, and get the consumer confidence back, which I believe is starting to wane at the moment. We need to think about the design process. And when I talk about design, I'm not talking about architecture here. I'm thinking about more holistic skills that actually, even involve people like me, like a QS, believe it or not, because this is about creativity. This is about challenging ourselves more and more. And this is a talent question for the future, not about, necessarily how we're going to do it, which is where we focus at the moment, but it's the what and why. Think about what, the creativity bit is about designing solutions. It might not be designing a house. It might be designing an economic model. It might be something which is about the journey of getting there, which involves innovation. And this is a really important thing in terms of how we're going to come together with technology, and it's already again been picked up about the interface between human talent and expertise and digital technology. And I think that is a fast-moving world. It's a world where actually that means we have a challenge in the education sector to design new ways of teaching and learning so that actually we're robust. I think there's a big piece here around how we redefine value. So at the moment, value in real estate is pounds per square foot. It's either a cost or a revenue type value. Value has to be holistic. It has to be about outcomes. It has to be about economic, social, environmental. We need to be driving that not just for a social value procurement governance piece in public sector, but in the private sector as well. And also, a lot of people talk about design for manufacture, DFMA. It's highly relevant to a lot of the work I do in off-site manufacturing. But actually, it's a lot more than that. It should be for designing for all these things as well. And it's back to this more holistic thinking that enables us to see value as design for Sigma, to take a term that a colleague of mine, Keith Waller, uses quite a lot. Keith leads the Construction Innovation Hub. Design for the Sigma is the design for the summation of all of that. If we drive that kind of thinking into the real estate and construction sector, we stand half a chance of performing what we do. I'd recommend this book to you if you haven't read it. The Future of the Professions is absolutely opened my eyes to what's coming. A lot of, again, what's already been talked about in terms of the tensions that we're going to have in professional services, where we're probably going to increasingly talk less about QSs and building surveyors and architects and structural engineers. We're going to talk about generic career families that sit in these kind of camps, which is all linked to how digital technology and professional services comes together. And that brings you to a concept of T-shaped workers. Many of you will have heard of T-shaped working, and the fact that actually the technical excellence requirement, that at the moment we're trained with a depth in a particular silo of working, whether it's surveying or engineering or real estate. Technology is going to do a lot of that heavy lifting and move us into a world where actually we have to concentrate on the horizontal element of the T, which is all of those softer skills there. So to close, what are Moby doing about it? We're trying to start from the beginning around schools outreach. We're trying to inspire kids with a different narrative of what our industry is about. We're trying to connect that with a whole route into the industry through from FE into HE, even into PhD type territory. The kind of narrative that actually isn't about the here and now, it's about the future, and biasing it towards the future in a way that actually gets kids' interests. Because what's not working at the moment for me quite clearly is taking kids on building sites like that, or bringing a Bob the Builder mascot and with a tool belt and a hard hat and high vis and talking down to kids. It's not the way we're going to do it. We have to re-image the industry. It has to be about real inspirational engagement. It has to be about a different story of what our industry is going to be in the future when these kids come into it. It has to be about interaction like design challenges, and there's a great one outside. And if you do that, you get engagement. And this is a sort of a quick chart of what Moby have been able to do over the last 3 years. But, you know, we're really fighting the tide here, and I know lots of others in this room are doing the same. You know, we're going to push on anyway and drive change in spite of the system in many respects, and through institutional barriers. We can't do it alone, though, so it needs everyone to coalesce around a common ambition to do things differently, re-image our industry and attract that talent we need. Thank you.
Just a very quick comment to our panellists. Thank you very much, first of all. We asked for thought-provoking. I'm not sure we asked for terrifying. So thank you for that. Thank you for the sort of War of the Worlds images. I found those particularly disturbing. I don't know what a dark store is yet, Dan, but I'm sure by the end of the evening you'll brief me in detail. And Amanda, I think you omitted something, at least from your 21 vision of London. At least I think you did. Is Crossrail finished by then or not? I'm not sure. Okay, so this is the fun part, and the good news is we're probably 20 minutes away from you being able to head into the reception area and enjoy a glass of fizz with us. So it's your opportunity to get engaged in today's discussion and debate, and we'd love to have your thoughts or your questions, either for individual panellists or for them collectively, and I'll do my very best to direct them accordingly. This, believe it or not, is our microphone. So as you would like to address a question to any of our panellists, if you'd stick your hand up, please don't stick your hand up at the back yet. My arm isn't that strong. We will get the microphone to you and we'll listen to your question and we'll let the panellists answer it. So who has a question for any one of our panel tonight? Brilliant. First one up there. Can you catch? Yeah?
Wow. Okay. I might keep this actually. So my name's Maria Coulter from Construction Coach. So I work a lot with small businesses in construction, helping them to grow and be more profitable. And I think the penny really dropped with me this year when I realised that there's about 1 million small businesses in construction at the moment. And a lot of the ones that I'm working with are really struggling with technology. So for example, I'm working with a house builder and a developer, and last year he turned over £1 million, but he's got no idea how much profit he made because he hasn't got basic spreadsheets in place to track that. And I'm also working with, you know, a mechanical and electrical contractor who's really struggling with technology. And I think a big challenge is that they don't know where to start. So they're not even using basic collaborative project management tools and things like that to be, you know, the most productive and profitable that they can be. And I'm finding they don't have the headspace and the cash flow at the moment to invest in the technology. And I think there's a real massive risk that we're going to leave a lot of these small businesses behind. I think we need some sort of solutions to help them engage with it, basically.
Great, thank you. So to summarise, it's not so much about the technology of the future, about the technology of today and the ability of small businesses to adopt it, and perhaps there's a productivity issue in there as well. Dan, do you want to comment first? Or?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great point, and I don't think there's an easy solution to it. I think there are probably a couple of things there. So I think as Mark said, the biggest challenge here isn't actually the technology. It's about finding the time and the effort and the ability to look into things. And there are a lot of good resources out there across government and I would say RSS and all sorts of organisations. Technology should never really be the point. It should only be about how do you actually solve a problem for it. So the first starting point is what are the top problems that you've got? And actually Excel spreadsheet can just as well answer a problem as some very clever AI solution. So I guess it's doesn't have to be expensive, but it does take a little bit of time just to work out what are the priorities in terms of problems and then go and find out the solutions from that.
Great, thanks, Dan. Anyone else on the panel want to add a few words? Mark?
So I absolutely identify with what you're saying there, Maria. I think the challenge is everything's so fast moving at the moment, you literally don't know where to start, and I get that. Actually, as an owner and leader of an SME business myself, as a consultant as opposed to a contractor, I see this firsthand. So we're going through a digital transformation, and I've sought help to do that. Had to invest in doing that, so you have to have the ability to be able to cash flow it, and I recognise that issue as well. But yeah, it very much starts with simple stuff like spreadsheets and digitising your data before you digitalise processes. So everyone thinks it's about robots and AI, but actually you have to do the fundamentals first, which is get your data structured. And once you structure your data, you can move on and evolve. But you have to do the simple things first before you dive in. In construction, as a contractor, or there's other things out there that are probably muddying the waters in terms of do I get involved in digital stuff on the construction site, process augmentation, stuff like that. And there are some initiatives out there that increasingly are very useful. So things like the Catapult program is an outreach point for small businesses to coalesce and to try stuff in collaboration. So the AMRC in Sheffield, for instance, is doing some great stuff with SMEs, where they're working with small builders, contractors, manufacturers to collectively. So there's a group of people showing them what's out there and just trying stuff. So it's just trying to find that solution. I understand though is pretty tricky and sometimes overwhelming.
Great, thank you. Has someone else got a question? There's one down here. There's one up there when we're next.
Thank you. Robin Nicholson, Cullinan Studio at the Edge. What I think really changed in the last 6 months is the climate imperative and the climate emergency. We know it's relatively easy to do new buildings that are carbon neutral, but do we know how to train and change our behaviour to transform the 80% of the existing buildings that will be there in 2050?
Great question. How do we upgrade our existing building stock? Oh, you're all rushing to take... Oh, great, Melissa, thank you.
Actually, renovations, there is quite a lot of work in that area. We are really very adept at it. The most important thing is, and I'll use Notre Dame as an example. The problem with Notre Dame is not the restoration. It's not actually keeping the building intact. And this is actually speaking to something much bigger. A lot of assumptions are made at the moment as to what the future building will look like. You will see basically replicas of the present that are just taller, they're all glass facades, they're all steel. There is no accounting for the resource shortages. So, for example, the fact that sand is so short that there are now mafias. There has been a diplomatic dispute between Singapore and Indonesia over the former, obviously, selling illegally sand that was stripped from beaches. And this is a colossal issue. When you actually look at the material availability over the trajectories and the real stats, as it were, as to that which is being bounded around, which is already outdated largely. We may not be able to use some of these materials that we're using currently in abundance, but we can revert to older materials. But essentially, we have a really big question to ask. Why did we move to glass? Why did we move to, why did Wren and so forth propose this mineral-based city? Well, of course, because of the risk of fire. But of course, wood as an architectural material has many very, very valiant features. It is more sustainable in that, of course, across England, we used to plant oak forests. The debate around Notre Dame is there are people who are actually rather ignorant of the way that an oak forest system lives, its cycle, as it were. They're saying, oh, don't chop down the oak forests. Well, oaks have a life cycle like us. After a certain amount of time, they enter what is old age. They become very vulnerable to beetle attacks and fires and so forth. So actually, it becomes advantageous to use oak. So looking forward, we have to think very seriously about materiality. We have to also recognise that the leaps in technology and in innovation, the leading edge students that I'm working with at places like the Bartlett through my visiting lecturing and critiquing and so forth, they do not work with stone. They don't work with glass. They would not consider those images the future. They are working with the likes of mycelium, mushroom. They grow buildings. They don't actually physically build them. So when you think to how we might renovate buildings, again, at the leading edge, they're not thinking in terms of the classic materials. They're bringing in these new materials. And what that presents is a fundamental challenge of how does it operate as a system what are the benefits? And what the benefits are is that you're no longer just building a space and controlling the climate. You're thinking about integrating energy systems, food systems, lighting systems. So you're having to think far beyond the sort of classic building narrative. But also you're facing challenges because, of course, if it's a grown material, it's carbon-based, it will burn. It might rot, it might, so there is a very big shift. But although, if we were to think forward, even as far as 20 years out from now, because of course we can't, any of us, know what the economic markets of the future will be. We can't anticipate what the commodities prices of 2040 will be, because we can't anticipate how the likes of Russia and all these other power players will impact on the markets and how it will all, all the things that are beyond our control will work. But what we can say is that we are very, very quickly pioneering these new concepts. They are building on much, much older narratives, and we're rediscovering the inherent properties of these older architectures. So, for example, today when you look at a renovated building, it will classically fuse old and new architectural paradigms without sort of, even acknowledging the virtues of the historic architecture. Now we're starting to realise, yes, they worked out water harvesting, they worked out passive architecture, they worked out how to live with fires, live with floods, live with earthquakes in the Bronze Age. So as we think forward, we have lots and lots of possible solutions. What we don't have, and it's exactly the same problem as the first question that arose, is the connectivity. And that is where the data comes in, that is where the conversations come in, because when we start to fuse those, renovation, 2050 is not an issue.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Amanda, any thoughts from you?
I'd just say the key to it is repurposing, and we've either got to kind of repurpose what we've got and use it so that we use it for different uses. We're seeing, car parks being adapted into other things. We're seeing offices moving into residential into offices. So I think that whole point I was making around, flexibility is key. But I think as was said by sort of some of the other panel, it's actually how do you build it in that's also really important. So that we're actually thinking long term about our buildings and actually the sustainability of them. Interestingly, actually in China, I think they're waking up to this in a really big way in terms of actually looking at the role of the building surveyor and actually how do you kind of use building surveying to really understand what you've got and adapt and change it rather than building the new shiny things. But I think for me, if I was placing a bet on one of the things we really need to wake up to as the built environment of the future is actually the built environment of today around sustainability and how do we build it in.
Great, thank you. We've definitely got time for at least a couple more questions. So we've got some hands up at the back and over here on the right. Just in the interests of people's thirsts, I'm going to ask our panellists to try and keep their answers as concise as possible. Otherwise, there'll be some sort of revolution that happens in here. Right.
Thank you very much indeed. My name's Sandy Rees-Jones. I've board for Britain on women in the construction industry for more years than I can think about. So much of this is familiar. It's a sort of tsunami of the same stuff, I'm afraid. What can we do to really make a difference? I think one of the themes that's come through from the excellent presentations is that we are an industry that tends to talk in rather dull words. I prefer to think not of data, but of what's behind the data, which is the intelligence. I ran my own business for many years. I was a small SME. I was a very early adopter of technology because it was the only way to survive. And I gathered information and research and data, but I turned it into intelligence and stories for my clients and customers. I think we have another theme here, which is storytelling, which is linked to the data and the intelligence. We've got in many parts of the world, as Amanda so vividly said, lots and lots and lots of young people. We've got lots and lots of young people who are frantic about the state of the world. And we have an opportunity for them actually for us to harness that interest and engage them in how we make a difference. I'm a non-exec director of a sustainable building products company. The brilliant thing is it's been set up by two young men, very young in my view, who felt that after 3 years of running a successful business, they needed some grey beards and grey hairs to help them run their business properly. So we have a combination of very young enthusiasm and the management skills that Dan is talking about. So it's a combination. But picking up on Mark's issue, the lone voice in moving forward change and the work you're doing with Moby, I've been running a roadshow for women in property, getting into a school, a very challenging school, and engaging them in opportunities for work in the construction industry. And the reason I got in was not because I said, can I come and talk to you with a crowd of women about building? I said, you're doing World War II in the history curriculum. Can I talk to you about World War II? Oh, yes, they said. Their eyes glazed over with building. They're very happy to talk about history. What they didn't realise they were getting was a story of Waterloo Bridge being built by women in the Second World War, and that women can do just about anything, and the school changed their curriculum. So my plea is, how can we get humanity into the debate, change the stories, and I'm saddened to hear that you're struggling too, Mark. So how do we get those stories, and how do we get construction to be as successful as engineering in changing the environment?
Thank you, brilliant. So how can we move the whole thing on a bit faster, Mark?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we're having a discussion at the moment as Moby, a prospective discussion with a partner to help take us into schools at a sort of an industrial scale, as a sort of a way of affecting the curriculum in a really sort of early stage, key stage 2 onwards. And it is about this point about what's the narrative that you're using to connect with the kids that actually, you know, ticks boxes with Ofsted and all sorts of things that are around the institutional reforms I mentioned that actually you have to fight against at the moment. Doesn't tick certain boxes, then it's not allowed. So what we're finding is the application of how the built environment connects to people's lives and actually how you make applied academic learning integrated into that is a really important element. And, you know, there's lots of initiatives out there already. You've got, you know, Class of Your Own, all sorts of different things happening where they're trying to do that. And again, they're all fighting the system. And I think the reality is you're only going to make a difference if you can do it at a scale. And that's the one thing that, you know, the benefit of having someone like George Clark involved is actually it gives you some profile that enables you to have a conversation that actually a lot of people, for no fault of their own, just haven't been able to have those conversations, and it gets you to a different position around trying to drive something at a strategic scale. And I'm hopeful, you know, and the thing about climate, Robin, what you mentioned now, I think I see as being one of the Trojan horses for how we're going to connect with kids. It's the why. What are we doing as an industry, as a built environment sector, towards safeguarding our future when it comes to climate change, infrastructure, community creation, a lot of the softer issues that are important to kids, and increasingly they're recognising them. If you can use that as the means of educating them in an applied way that gets them inspired in what we do as an industry, and not talk about, you know, one of the things that is happening at the moment is for good intended people going into schools and putting Minecraft programs on in front of kids, or talking about BIM very superficially. It's basically the sort of digital fairy dust sprinkled on what is still a very traditional analog industry. We need to get technology, social, environmental outcomes embedded in the DNA when we talk to kids. And it is about doing that on the scale. And it's not about any one organisation hiding that and keeping it up their jumper. We need to share that as a toolkit for the entire industry, so we all speak with one voice.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask for one more quick comment on that. Amanda, you look like you'd like to say something.
Sandy, really great question, and as you know, likewise really passionate about it. I think the key to it is actually how we collaborate. You know, we're very fragmented as an industry, and it's how do we come together? It's all about attraction. How do we really get that top talent excited about coming into the sector that we all love? You're all role models. You know, the more that you can actually do that storytelling, as Sandy says, you know, that's really, really empowering. But actually, for me also, it's actually people from that generation actually being excited and talking to that generation. So certainly, you know, a couple of years ago with RICS, we took out Eve Bennett and Ali A. If you haven't heard of them, that's okay. You're probably the wrong age demographic. But actually, to give you a sense, so when you get somebody like Ali A, who has, you know, multi-million followers, actually talking to that generation, the hit rate of the storytelling goes up to like 74,000 in one weekend was literally the stat. So that's how we have to get that next generation. We have to make it exciting for them, and we have to come together.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask one final question, and then maybe we can just get each of our panellists to give a very short answer, and then we'll move you through into reception. Over here. Well done for being so persistent.
Thank you. Dominic Grace from Savills. First of all, brilliant presentations, thought-provoking, as you say, slightly dystopian and alarmist as well. Quite a bit of reference to what's going on in other countries in future, particularly Amanda, talking about China and India. It's fantastic. They've obviously got huge growing populations, as you talked about, young. But ultimately, and this is relevant, I think, as we slingshot our way out of Brexit, they are also going to be our competitors. Now, they've got, if you like, sort of politics that allows a much more draconian approach to demolition of existing buildings, etc. Are we brave enough in this country to face that and actually get on and do it at a political and societal level to compete? Because otherwise, I think I see things right now, we're just so awash with retrospective thoughts about our place in the world and where we used to be, etc., that we're just simply not going to allow ourselves to do the things in the real estate sector that we'll need to do to compete. Thoughts, please.
Brilliant question. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists for a very short answer on that one. Is politics going to get in the way of doing what we need to do?
Potentially.
Okay.
I judge on international awards, and what I can say of China of this last 12 years is, whereas it would have a few winners 12 years ago, today it's every year. They're coming in with very, very strong young talent. They are clearly doing something very right in their education. Our standard is on a par, maybe even dropping. And so I think we have to rise to the challenge. We have to acknowledge that we are not necessarily the best anymore. We have to invest in our universities. We have to give our young people the support on every level to flourish in this world, because it is going to get much more competitive and we will slip if we don't make the investment.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Dan, perhaps we should just automate the politicians. How about that?
I think there are certain questions I should duck, so I'll leave that one. I think you saw on the slide there, I mean, obviously went through it quite quickly, but comparing those different countries, I think from a digital technology point of view, the UK has all the ingredients. It's doing everything it needs to be the world leader, so absolutely yes. That wasn't quite the point of the question, and it was about whether other people will get in the way of that. And I think the government is doing so much good stuff. It's amazing. It's completely disjointed. And so there's a real opportunity for us to bring it together. All of the really big, expensive, long-term hard bits are actually largely done. By far, not close to perfect, but further ahead than others. I think there's also a real responsibility of the industry. If you go to America to stereotype massively, if you go and say, I've had this great idea, I'd like to try something, their answer tends to be, let's give it a go. If you go to the UK, it tends to be, that sounds awesome. When everyone else is doing it, come back and I'm right on board. And that attitude we have to change. And it doesn't have to be difficult or expensive or anything else. So I think the government does have a role to play. I think industry does as well. And I desperately hope the UK can use technology as a differentiator.
Brilliant, thank you, Dan. Amanda?
I think things like the National Infrastructure Commission for me were really exciting, because actually that starts to put in place something that sits trans-governmental and actually takes that longer term perspective in terms of 30 years and beyond for this country. And I think also when you look at the opportunity around the infrastructure spend and what's going to be happening in that actually makes this built environment incredibly exciting for the next generation to come into. Couple that with the amount of homes that need to be built, and I think actually what it's saying to me is that there's a massive skills gap, and with that comes an opportunity. And I look to the two guys either side of me, both through technology and I think modern methods of construction, as really kind of key enablers, both to actually help deliver on that skills gap to actually, in terms of the built environment, but also to create something that's really exciting about this sector that really appeals to that next generation. And hopefully then they're coming through to the University College of Estate Management to get their education.
Brilliant, thank you, Amanda. I'm still enjoying the comment earlier about you don't have to make a profit to have a successful business. Anyway, Mark, would you like to close out our thinking on this one?
Yeah, so I think I'd answer that in two parts. So from a construction perspective, I'd separate that from real estate. You'll be quite surprised in my journeys across the world, and if I was to look at Hong Kong and Singapore as two sort of relatively autocratic political state nations that are getting on doing some really interesting stuff in construction, digital technology, MMC. UK is not that far behind, actually. We've got this great opportunity at the moment with government interest. We've got the sector deal. We've got transforming construction. There's a whole load of stuff happening. We've got a government presumption in favour of MMC for 5 of the biggest spending government departments at the moment. If we deliver on that, we'll be actually on a par. Where the difference occurs politically is in the real estate sector, probably in land and planning, where actually some of the more ambitious things we probably need to do, which in Hong Kong and Singapore is get on and do it, actually is too politicised here, and it's actually quite polarised from the two major parties as to what they're prepared to do around Greenbelt and permitted development, state-controlled building programmes, stuff like that. And that's where I see the difference at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. It does feel like we could go on for a very long time, and perhaps the best thing to do is to ask you to save any other questions you've got. Our panellists are joining us afterwards at the reception, so I'm sure they'd be delighted to share their views on any other topics that you've got. Just before I close proceedings and move us through into the reception, please would you join me in thanking Melissa, Dan, Amanda and Mark for their fantastic contribution today.